Hey everyone, welcome to the Grad Coach Podcast. My name is Derek, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ethar, one of our trusty coaches. And we're going to be talking about 4 cheat codes that you can use to fast track your research methodology. If you're busy working on a methodology chapter, you'll probably want to grab a copy of our free methodology chapter template over on the Grad Coach blog. You can find the link to that in the description. So without further delay, let's get this party started. Dr. Ethar, welcome back to the pod.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me.
Awesome. So let's jump into it. So our very first methodology cheat code is to take the IKEA approach and treat the methodology like an instruction manual. This sounds pretty interesting. What's this all about?
Yes, it's that basic idea. So that ideally, when you think of your methodology as being an instruction manual, so much like you would see in IKEA piece of furniture where you've got the steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. You take this piece, you attach it to that piece, you fit it together, you've got your nice little table set up. It's the same basic principle with respect to your methodology. The hope would be that the methodology that you end up producing is something that somebody else can replicate and end up with exactly the same results that you produced, which means 2 things in principle. Number 1, this should be as clear, as straightforward, and as easy to understand as it can possibly be, because as I said a moment ago, we'd like it to be the case that somebody else can pick up that methodology from where you left it off, continue your research, and end up in exactly the same place that you ended up with exactly the same results. Of course, not the same interpretation of those results. That's number 1. But number 2, it also offers you the opportunity to understand exactly how the different parts of your methodology work alongside one another. So ideally, you want to think about, for example, how your sampling strategy will affect your data collection, or how your research philosophy might affect your data analysis. So just to give you an example of what that might sound like, if you have a sampling strategy that involves non-probability purposive sampling, and you want to end up with something like 100 different participants, well, in that particular case, maybe it's not the most functional thing to say that you want to have open-ended interviews that last an hour or 2 with every single one of these participants, because the likelihood is you're going to end up with enormous quantities of data. Now, in some cases, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. In others, it's not exactly functional. So what we're trying to do is to think about the methodology, as I said, like an IKEA manual, so that you don't just have a sense of how to put this together and somebody else can replicate it, but you've also got a clear sense of how all these pieces fit together at the end, so you have something functional and workable for the purposes of your project.
The analogy is fantastic because clarity is so important in this section in terms of any research project, where it's a dissertation or thesis or something smaller. It's so important to get really clear in terms of what you're doing. What we so often see with students is that they might present a really good introduction, a really good literature review, and then they get to this dreaded methodology chapter and it all starts becoming a little bit vague. You can very quickly sense that they haven't quite thought this through as well as they should have. So if you take that analogy of an IKEA manual, this is a manual that is providing step-by-step guidance as to what exactly needs to be done and is putting it in a very, very intuitive fashion. It's creating a narrative, it's creating a story, and that's exactly what you want with your methodology chapter. Of course, your methodology chapter needs to do a little bit more in that it also needs to justify and rationalize, and we'll talk about that a little bit more a little bit later. But it's a really useful analogy. And to the point you made earlier about you need to create an instruction manual that someone else could follow and essentially undertake the same study, that's really, really important. Once you think of your objective as that, once you think of someone being able to really read your methodology and go, okay, got it, I can do this too, then you're going to be writing with a tremendous amount of clarity.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly the point. That's what we're really looking for. So in principle, what it does is actually removes the researcher from the process. And I think that's largely a healthy thing. We want it to be the case that your research is independent of you insofar as humanly possible. It kind of reinforces the validity of the research. It removes any sense of research bias, and it takes out the subjectivity in your interpretation of your results, which makes it slightly more generalizable. So you want it to be the case that the methodology is something exactly as we've said, that somebody else can pick up and end up in the same place that you've ended up in. So we want it to be as formal, as clean, as simple, and as easy to understand as humanly possible.
So let's jump on to methodology cheat code number 2. And this is a biggie. This is really, really important. And it's something that we see a lot of students missing in terms of their write-ups. And that is to assess your methodological choices against your research aims and your research questions. A lot of big words there. What's this all about, Dr. E?
It sounds more complicated than it is, as tends to be the case with the methodology. As a side point, it's worth noting that a lot of the terminology and a lot of the language involved in the methodology can be disconcerting. So a lot of this is stuff that you hear and it sounds as though it's difficult to understand and it's difficult to know what this means. But rationalizing your methodological choices against your research aim and research questions should make the whole process a lot easier and a lot simpler to rationalize, a lot simpler to make sense of, in other words, which is to say that presumably by the time you arrive at your methodology, you should have already determined what the aim of your research is going to be, or your research aim, your RA, and you should have already determined what the primary questions or question of your research is going to be, so your research questions or your RQs. In principle, what you want to do is to assess your methodology or the intended means by which you're going to develop, collect, and analyze data against those research aims and research questions, to see whether or not it fits, see whether or not it makes sense, and see whether or not ultimately it's beneficial to the research. This also gives you an opportunity to consider, for example, the subjectivity and objectivity implicit in your research aims and research questions. And what I mean by that is it might be the case that your research aims are much more oriented towards determining people's, say, thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and opinions about a particular phenomenon or a particular subject matter. Conversely, you might be much more interested in trying to determine empirical facts, so the number of people that attended a particular event, or the number of people that voted in a particular direction, or the number of people that voted with their feet in going to a particular restaurant, or whatever it might happen to be. Well, if your concerns are empirically oriented, well, that kind of inclines your methodology in a certain direction, and that's implied by your research aim and research questions. By the same token, if your research is subjectively oriented, let's say oriented towards people's thoughts, feelings, and opinions, the same thing is there. That should incline your methodology in the same direction. It ought to have an impact on what that means for example, your data analysis, what that means, for example, in terms of your data collection, what that means, for example, in terms of how you interpret that data, even up to the framework that you decided to adopt at an earlier stage and how that impacts the interpretation of the data that you collect.
I think another way to put this, to really just break it down, is to say, if I look at my research questions, let's put the research aims aside for a moment. If I look at my research questions, is the methodology that I'm using, is my how a suitable way to answer these questions? So you mentioned previously a study that is focused on exploring thoughts and feelings and perceptions as opposed to something that's perhaps a bit more numbers focused. Naturally, if your research aims and your research questions are interested in people's thoughts and feelings and perceptions, then it's more likely that you're going to take a qualitative approach and all that entails from a methodological perspective. So you want to make sure that you're using the right tools for the job, I guess is another way of putting it. You want to look at your research aims and your research questions and ask yourself, what's the nature of what I'm trying to understand here? And am I using the right tools for the job? Very often students have an interesting set of research questions, but then from a methodological perspective, they've got a leaning towards something specific that may or may not be related. So you might find that the student's really interested in the quant side of things. They really are numbers oriented. They're a numbers person, but then their research project, and by extension, their research aims and their research questions, is focused on something that would be better explored with qualitative methodologies and approaches. And so they're trying to shoehorn this methodology into the project when it shouldn't be that way. So I think if you can just circle it back, we've used a lot of big terminology here, and even things like research aims and research questions, perhaps those things aren't so clear to you, and we'll link to some resources below this video so that you can go and just lay the right foundations there. But to circle it back, we're really asking the question here, or advising you to ask the question, am I using the right tool for the job? And the job is your research aims and your research questions, and the tool is your methodology.
Absolutely. I mean, there's an inclination, it's one that you pointed to a moment ago, for a person to want to, or for a student to want to as you said, lean towards quantitative or lean towards qualitative, either because they think one of them gives them greater validity or one of them gives them more generalizability, or one perhaps is just something that they're more comfortable with than the alternative. There's a tendency to want to do this in some instances, of course. But what we're saying here is that if you were to lean into what the aim of your research is in the first place, what the primary question of your research is, what it is that you're trying to discover, what it is you're trying to understand, and what purpose that solves, the more you lean into that, the stronger the methodology actually is. Because then it seems as though the tools, as you said, the tools that we've adapted for the research are appropriate for the job itself. So you want to lean into that.
So true. We hammer on about this so often on the blog, and I'm sure in other videos, is that your research aims and your research questions pretty much dictate / at least influence everything else, and especially influence your methodology. So that alignment is so important, and therefore it's cheat code number 2. So let's jump on to cheat code number 3. And if you thought that was a mouthful of big words that we're using in the previous one, here's one that hopefully I can even say right on the first time. So cheat code number 3 is to adopt a rationalization by elimination approach. Glad I got that one right, but I'll hand the mic over to you, Dr. E. What are you talking about here? What is this?
First and foremost, you didn't think having a philosopher on the team wasn't going to involve some complex multisyllabic words. That was going to happen. Somewhere along the line, I've got to make it clear I worked really hard to get here. You got to use some complicated terms. But that aside, it's actually a relatively straightforward thing, and it's actually something that we tend to do in day-to-day life more common than we acknowledge, which is to say that in some instances, it might not be the most obvious or the most straightforward thing for you to look at all the methodological options, whether that's with respect to your data analysis or your data collection or your sampling strategy, and say, okay, well, based on the litany of options I had before me, it's relatively clear which ones I should pick relative to my research aim or my research questions. Those things are sometimes a little complicated, and given the number of options available to you, it's not always the most straightforward thing in the world to just be able to pick one out the hat and say, that's definitively the best option I have for the purposes of my research. In those instances where it's a little more complicated, you can, as you said, do this thing where you rationalize by elimination. And what this basically means is that you're identifying the most appropriate methodological choice by eliminating the alternatives. So it's not so much a question of positively selecting which methodological choice is the best for your research aim or your research questions or your research generally, but rather which ones can be negatively eliminated. So which ones are the most inappropriate, and you see which one, what that leaves behind. Relatively common example of this, or relatively easy example of this, one that I go through on a regular basis with students, is the data analysis method. So given your research, often it's the case there are 2 or 3 or 4 sometimes different data analysis methods that might be appropriate for your research, particularly considering that you might have a complex or large research aim that involves more than one primary concern, especially if you have research questions, of course, that also have sub-questions. So things get a little bit more complicated in that case, and that might mean that you have 2 or 3 data analysis methods that seem appropriate, at least positively speaking. When in those instances, it's a little bit easier sometimes to go through those data analysis options and just say, okay, well, let's eliminate the ones that seem the least likely or the ones that produce the least effective results for what it is that we're trying to do. And what that will mean is it reduces the options down for you. It points you in the direction of the kind of thing that you should be doing. And most importantly, it ends up reinforcing the rationalization that you have to include in your methodology for why you made the choices that you made. It becomes much more straightforward, even if you are describing that via negativo. See how that works?
I guess an analogy here is the old trick that students take to answering multiple choice type exams, where you're just kind of starting, if you're looking at a question and you're looking at a set of answers and you have no idea, you start by going, well, which is the least likely, and then narrowing your way down. So it's a similar sort of approach here. I think when we talk about rationalization by elimination, obviously, there's the theoretical component. In other words, if you are, to our early example, if you're exploring people's perceptions and feelings and the soft stuff, you can pretty much immediately eliminate the whole quant side of research, because naturally qualitative is more effective and more well suited for that. So that's the theoretical sort of justification and rationalization. But another criteria that you might evaluate, or that you certainly should evaluate, is just your practical constraints. Is just say, well, what do I, as a first-time researcher or a new researcher, or perhaps an experienced researcher with no funding for this project, what can I reasonably do in terms of data collection, in terms of data analysis? Naturally, some things are going to cost a lot more than others. Some are going to require special resources, for example, lab equipment, or access to groups or samples, or whatever the case may be. So you want to be eliminating on the theoretical bases, and you certainly want to look at it from a practical perspective as well, because unless this is just a purely conceptual research methodology for study you're never going to do, you are going to need to be very, very realistic about your approach. And so those are two criteria. Perhaps there's more, but those are two criteria that you can use to help you sort of eliminate and chip away at the seemingly endless stream of possible options when it comes to methodology.
Very, very true. In fact, I've said this to students in the past, that the methodologies that people, or data analysis methods, for example, that people tend to peg for, there are some common ones, there are some more popular ones, but the fact of the matter is that there are many, many, many options. And the truth is that research continues, theory develops, universities continue doing what they're doing, and who knows, as data analysis methods continue to advance, there are further ones that are developed that may or may not be appropriate for what it is that you're trying to achieve. Ideally, as we've already said, you go through the options, you start eliminating what does and doesn't make sense. And if you're lucky, you might be able to find a compendium somewhere that lists them all off and tells you exactly what these data methods are. Oh, I feel like we do that. I feel like we might have that. There might be a blog post somewhere. I don't know, I'm just guessing. I just feel like we have a blog post somewhere that does this for you. But I'll let you tell them about it.
Well, do we? I'm not sure. But if not, we're definitely going to be creating something like that in the future. So
it'll be there.
For the time being, there's certainly no shortage of options for students to explore. All right, so let's move on to our fourth and final methodology cheat code, and that is to fully understand and appreciate your university's research ethics policy before you start crafting your methodology chapter, and ideally before you even start thinking about methodology, because this is another potential elimination criteria that you can use. So university ethics policies, this is muddy territory and quite frankly pretty frustrating for a lot of new researchers. Dr. E, what do we need to know?
Well, as you've said, there are a couple of things that you should bear in mind before you can begin conducting your research. In fact, before you even begin constructing your methodology, which is to say that university will have ethics requirements, and there are probably going to be ethics forms that you're going to have to fill in, apply for, and get consent from your university before you actually conduct the research. Now, it sounds more complex than it is. These forms can be long-winded, and again, they look worse than they in fact are. Ultimately, what it boils down to is this idea that you're trying to avoid harming anybody involved in the research that you're conducting. So you're adhering to what's known as the harm principle, generally speaking, although this can be broken down into a few component parts. So you've got the issue of consent, you've got the issue of welfare, confidentiality, data security, transparency. You can break it down into these 5 different categories. And in each case, ultimately, all we're trying to do is to make sure that the people, if there are people involved, but that anybody and everybody that's involved in the research is not harmed, is not coerced into producing any of their research, and that their privacy is secured at all times. I mean, relatively straightforward things that you would assume should be the case. I don't think anybody would think that when they're conducting research, they should be causing anybody any harm, nor should it be the case that you're doing anything that involves you invading somebody else's privacy. If that's what you wanted to do, you might want to rethink the project altogether.
A small price to
but
pay.
In principle,
a small price to pay, right? For growing the body of knowledge. Surely we could bend a few rules here.
No, you can't. Let's make this clear. So we've said this in the past. There have been previous blog posts, I think, on ethics. And if not, we've got other content on this information. But generally speaking, your research just won't get off the ground in the first place until you have the confirmation of your university and you have the consent of your university to go ahead and conduct it. Because it absolutely needs to be the case that everybody who's involved in your research, even if it is just yourself, another researcher, and perhaps 1 or 2 participants, even if you don't have huge participant numbers and a massive sampling strategy and so on and so forth, even if you have tiny numbers of participants, in fact, even if your participants aren't human. So even in the case where you're looking at research that involves animals. In those instances too, you have to be making sure that at no point is your research going to cause any harm, going to cause any damage, going to negatively affect your participants in any way, shape or form, and to make sure that they have their consent, forgive me, that you have their consent the whole way through, and that their privacy is secure the entire way through the process. I mean, if nothing else, it just reinforces the likelihood that the participant involved is going to be willing to give you the answers that you want and willing to engage if they know that their security is guaranteed from the outset.
I guess it's really important to highlight here that while we're speaking about fairly generic research ethics principles, every university is going to be a little bit different. Generally, you're going to find that, the more, how shall I put this? The more well-reputed universities are going to be particularly careful about what they do and don't allow their students to do from a research ethics perspective. And you might ask your question, well, what does it matter to them? It's my project, it's my research that I'm doing. Why do they get involved? Why are they intervening? But ultimately, it's their reputation that's on the line, because you, as a student undertaking research within a program, you're essentially representing that university. So it's really useful to understand that each university has its own set of research ethics. And so even if this is something that you've encountered previously, maybe you've done a dissertation or a thesis at another university for a different program and you think, no worries, I got this covered, I understand research ethics. It really varies per university. So you want that to be your starting point. You want to, before you even start thinking about research topics, one of the very first things that you want to try get in your hand is this damn research ethics policy from your university. Find out what you can do and what you can't do. And there's another little nuance here that's worth mentioning is that in some cases, you may find that this project that you want to undertake and this methodology that you want to use is acceptable from an ethics perspective, but it falls into some specific category. So for example, if you want to undertake research on any sort of vulnerable groups, let's say patients in a hospital or something like that, that may be allowed, but because you've gone that route, you're now going to require all sorts of other additional approvals and additional processes that ensure that you don't cross any line because those groups are vulnerable. And that's going to slow your project down. It's going to reduce the amount of freedom that you have, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't mean that you necessarily shouldn't do that, but you want to take those factors into account from the outset. Otherwise, you're going to run down this road excitedly and then find that either your project doesn't get approved or you do get approved with a set of very big handcuffs and suddenly you don't get to do what you were planning to do. So keep that in mind.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that actually extends to a general point about your methodology altogether, which is to say that these things will vary from university to university. So your methodology, your research project as a whole doesn't exist in the ether. Get it?
Mm-hmm.
All right, never mind. I'll put that aside. It doesn't exist in the ether. I'm the ether. Anyway, the point is, it doesn't exist in the ether. These things are practical endeavors, and that there are rules and guidances and principles involved in the practical endeavor of developing research, developing a methodology, and developing ethics considerations. And in each case, it would be helpful for you to go to your university, go to the appropriate department, go to the appropriate committee member or chair or supervisor, or whoever it may happen to be that's guiding you through the research or in a position to be able to advise you through your research, and ask them for the information that they should be able to provide you with respect to what's expected, with respect to your methodology, with respect to your ethics, but with respect to your research project overall. What you don't want to be the case, and this has happened in a few instances, is you go online, you do your own research. I hate when people do that, but you do your own research, whatever that means. You find out a bunch of information about data analysis methods or a bunch of information about data collection and sampling strategies and research philosophies. And then you end up including into your methodology a huge quantity of information that ultimately just isn't required by your university. So you've just ended up spending time and effort trying to understand something and incorporating something that wasn't actually required in the first place. And then you find yourself kicking yourself. It's just unnecessary. So just as a practical endeavor, it would be very, very helpful to think of your research from the outset as a professional, academic, practical endeavor that's guided, guarded, and restricted by the university that you're working within. And then you ask them or inquire from them as to what the templates are, what the requirements are, what input that they can possibly give you in terms of what they expect, not just for your research project overall, not just for your methodology, but for your research project overall. So you've got some sense of where you're heading, and you've got some sense of what is required of you as you make your way through this process. So there's no wasted effort.
Always start with the constraints. This kind of plays into cheat code number 3 that we spoke about, which is rationalization by elimination. If you're starting your project ideation process or your topic ideation process with a clear view of all the constraints that you have, you just save yourself so much hassle, related to research ethics and to methodology more broadly. Some universities or some programs will require that you can exclusively use secondary data. In other words, data that you're not collecting. And if you don't know that, if you're not aware of that that restriction or requirement from the outset, you can find yourself just wasting so much time exploring so many different topic options that simply aren't valid because you wouldn't be able to do them with secondary data. So it's really, really useful to start with the restrictions and all of that upfront, and most importantly, the research ethics, because as you say, there's just no getting around that. You might think, well, I have this fantastic research idea and it will be so valuable and it will be so meaningful in the world, and we just got to bend this rule, this ethics thing a little bit, that rule number 5. If we can just scratch that one off for this specific project, then it's going to be awesome. You don't have a chance. You just don't have a chance. These things are very, very strictly governed. And if your idea and your methodology doesn't tick all the boxes in terms of research ethics or the research ethics policy, you're done. You're absolutely done.
I mean, look, the thing is to remember, and I think we've mentioned this in the past, I'm going to mention it over and over again until I'm blue in the face. There's a tendency when people begin research to think of themselves as kind of existing in a vacuum and doing the research themselves. And this is brand new to you, and you don't necessarily know what you're doing in every single case, and you don't know how to develop this, and it's a new idea, and you're trying to develop the appropriate angles and the way to think about it. But the fact of the matter is, this is a university institution that you are working within. They've done this before. You guarantee yourself that you won't be the first person to do this kind of research, even if you found a meaningful research gap. I promise you someone's done something like this before. The university has done things like this before. They do this thousands and thousands of times a day, thousands and thousands of times a year. They're very, very accustomed to this, which means that even if it seems as though you're doing this on your own, and even if you find yourself in a situation where maybe you don't have the most helpful staff or the most helpful committee members or the most helpful supervisors, the fact of the matter is that this information will be available. It's just a question of asking the right person or finding it. But there are going to be guidances on what they expect to see in a methodology. There are going to be guidances on what they expect to see in your ethics. There are going to be guidances on what they expect to see in your research project overall. So the more you ask those questions, the more information you can gather up at an early stage of the research, the better position you put yourself in for the rest of the research to make sure that not only are you doing what you're supposed to be doing, but you're not wasting any time doing those things you don't really need to be doing.
All right, so let's wrap this up with a quick recap. So the 4 cheat codes for writing up your methodology, and I guess just defining your methodology more broadly, are number 1, to take the IKEA approach and to treat your methodology like an instruction manual, or your methodology chapter like an instruction manual. Number 2, to assess your methodological choices, so all of the little decisions that you've made against your research aims and your research questions. Number 3, to adopt a rationalization by elimination approach. In other words, think about what's definitely not suitable and scratch all those options off the list and then narrow your way down. And then number 4, possibly the most important one, is to fully understand your university's research ethics policy before you start crafting your methodology, and ideally before you even start your topic ideation process, because that's where you're going to identify your research aims and your research questions. So that wraps up our 4 methodology cheat codes. Dr. E, thank you so much for joining us and for enlightening us once again.
Pleasure to be of service as ever. You know where you can find me. I'm always right here. It's the only Dr. E you're going to find. But thank you very much.
All right, so that wraps up this episode of the Grad Coach Podcast. Remember, if you're currently working on a methodology chapter, be sure to grab our free chapter template over on the Grad Coach blog. You can find the link to that in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please do remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and you'll definitely want to check out this video next. I'll see you there.